Ta-da!
Hello gamers, Matthew here from Grey Army Gaming in lovely Lund, Sweden. For today's episode of Musings of a Philogamer, we will be looking at the theme of seeing as a terrain builder on perception, existence, and wargaming terrain construction. Before we get started, I would just like to direct you to greyarmygaming.com. There you can click on downloads and then follow the link to Musings of a Philogamer episodes where you can download the PDF of this essay if you'd like to follow along now or to read it later. By way of introduction, we may begin with a quote from the Danish thinker Søren Kierkegaard regarding the nature of visual perception. As he writes in one of his 1843 discourses, observation does not depend merely upon what one sees, but what one sees depends upon how one sees. All observation is not just a receiving, a discovery, but also a bringing forth, and insofar it is that, how the observer is constituted is indeed decisive. With this, Kierkegaard draws a stark connection between existence and perception, and in such fashion reminds us of a central philosophical truth. The manner by which we exist fundamentally shapes the manner by which we perceive. In what follows, I would like to explore this dynamic interplay between existence and perception in relation to wargaming terrain construction. Or rather, I would like to employ this dynamic as a means of analyzing the process that I myself have undergone in becoming and operating as a terrain builder. Although my terrain construction capabilities in no way compare to those of professional terrain builders, I would argue that regardless of skill level, the phenomenon is nevertheless the same. In undertaking the task of terrain construction, one begins to see the world in a radically new light as richer, more meaningful, and more beautiful. Our essay today is therefore an attempt to make some headway into understanding this phenomenon. With this aim in mind, we begin by sketching out one theory of perception put forward by Thomas Hobbes that has itself proven influential within Western thought. Following this, we touch upon the thought of Ludwig Wittgenstein, developed in his work Philosophical Investigations, as presenting a contrasting account of perception. Having laid this foundation, we return to the activity of wargaming terrain construction and offer a brief analysis of the phenomenon of seeing the world differently, that is the consequence of seeing in the role and capacity of a terrain builder. As the first step in my argument, we may begin with a brief overview of the 17th century account of perception developed by English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Although Hobbes' theory of perception has been described with a variety of fancy labels including materialist, sensationalist, and empiricist, his main idea is fairly simple. Perception is nothing more than the process by which impressions originating from objects in the world are, in a literal sense, impressed upon the senses of the recipient. Early on in his magnum opus, Leviathan, Hobbes outlines his account as follows. The object of the external world worketh on the eyes, ears, and other parts of man's body, and by diversity of work produceth diversity of appearances. The origin of them all is that which we call sense, for there is no conception in a man's mind which hath not at first, totally or by parts, been begotten upon the organs of sense. The rest are derived from that original. The cause of sense is the external body, or object, which presseth the organ proper to each sense. Important to notice here is that in Hobbes' view, perception is something passive in the sense that the perceiver has no active but merely a reactive role to play in what is perceived. If it helps, we might think of this process as roughly akin to that by which a piece of wax is given the impression of a royal seal from a signet ring. In both cases, there is a clear unidirectionality at work with respect to cause and effect, where a human being, just as wax, is on the receiving end. As we will see below, it is just such a construal of the individual on which Wittgenstein sets his sights, and in response to which he develops an alternative account of what it means to perceive. Before moving on to Wittgenstein, however, we should briefly pause in order to address an objection. At this point, one might be wondering why we are affording so much attention to what appears to be an antiquated 17th century theory. In response, I would suggest that this theory is not, in fact, as antiquated as it may seem, but rather, to the contrary, Hobbes' account operates as the default way that many of us in our modern, materialist, scientific, technological societies think about perception. Ask anyone, for example, about the mechanics of vision, and you will likely get a story about how light, color, shapes, etc. make their way into the eyes, at which point they are simply absorbed passively in a direct and unmediated fashion. Indeed, if my suspicion here is correct, then Wittgenstein's alternative account becomes that much more relevant for us today. Austrian-British philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein is arguably the most important philosopher of the 20th century. Although he focused in his early work on the theoretical foundations of mathematics, in his later writings, and in particular in his posthumously published Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein becomes increasingly fascinated with language and perception. With respect to the latter, he takes upon himself the task of drawing out the strangeness of this phenomenon in order to be able to illuminate and to better understand it. In contrast to views such as those of Hobbes, Wittgenstein argues that perception is not as simple as receiving impressions from external objects. As he remarks, "Isn't it a misleading metaphor to say, 'My eyes give me the information that there is a chair over there'?" Rather, perception for Wittgenstein also involves, in important ways, the perceiver who is also a subject. To drive home this point, Wittgenstein introduces the notion that he identifies as aspect perception, or rather, seeing as. Whereas Hobbes speaks simply about seeing something, which, as we outlined above, is merely the object impressing itself upon the perceiver, Wittgenstein speaks about seeing something as something, where the subject is intimately involved in this process. Let us develop this point by considering two examples. We may begin first of all with the famous duck-rabbit drawing. In perceiving this image, we do not simply receive a picture of the figurine as an unintelligible blob, but rather we see it as a duck or as a rabbit. Put differently, meaning and significance jump out of the image in our very engagement with it. A second example Wittgenstein employs is that of seeing a resemblance between two faces. As he writes, "I contemplate a face and then suddenly notice its likeness to another. I see that it has not changed, and yet I see it differently. I call this experience noticing an aspect." Again, it is not that one simply sees one face and then sees another, but rather one sees one face as resembling the other. Both of these cases of perception are for Wittgenstein deeply paradoxical. As he puts it, the expression of a change of aspect is the expression of a new perception, and at the same time of the perceptions being unchanged. In other words, we see the same thing, but in seeing it as something, we see something different. If nothing else, this account of perception levels a radical challenge to the Hobbesian reductive account. Judith Genova sums this up well when she remarks, "Seeing is not the simple camera-like activity we ordinarily take it to be. That is, as we look at the world, our seeing is not simply informed by facts, but organized by contexts and patterns, prior personal histories, anticipatory beliefs, and even ad hoc imaginary flights. Seeing as shows us the multiplicity involved in seeing. For Wittgenstein, what makes possible this form of perception as seeing as is the fact that the perceiver is always perceiving within a particular given linguistic, social, and cultural context, what he rather obscurely identifies as a form of life, Lebensform. What this means is that carrying out the process of seeing as necessitates that one is always already seeing in the capacity of a particular existential position. That is, one is seeing as one who is familiar with ducks and rabbits, as one who has experience with faces and facial features, as one who is a female, as a Swede, as a mechanic, as one who is middle class, as an English speaker, and so on and so on. To reiterate then, we can say that all seeing as necessarily presupposes that one is seeing as. In order for one to see something as meaningful requires that one is already perceiving from a meaningful context. To wrap up this discussion of Wittgenstein, allow me to elucidate the preceding point on the connection between seeing as and seeing as with a concrete example from my youth. When I was in my early teens, I took up the sport of trick skating, and over the course of several years, I became rather proficient. You could say that I had become quite at home in this particular existential mode. And somewhere in this process, something incredible happened. I began to see the world as a skater. Cities and public spaces came alive in ways that they never had before. Suddenly, ledges, railings, and stairs all began to pop out with meaning and significance. For example, I no longer saw a railing simply as a hand guide leading down a set of stairs, but rather as an invitation to a grind, with its own particular entry and exit points. In one sense, I saw the same thing as everyone else, but in another sense, the particular manner of seeing as in relation to the railing was only possible because I was now seeing it as a skater. Seeing as and seeing as. Armed with these insights, let us finally turn to the phenomenon of terrain construction. What does it mean then to talk about seeing as a terrain builder? In short, by beginning to build terrain, we enter into a new existential mode, and it is here that we begin to see things differently, precisely, and that we begin to see them from a new form of life as a builder. In my case, it was just over a year ago that I began to dedicate myself seriously to constructing wargaming terrain and to becoming a wargaming terrain builder. This process in turn has been radically transformative. Allow me to offer an example of this. Prior to becoming a terrain builder, I would often ride the train from the west coast in southern Sweden through the countryside over to the east coast. And this trip was oftentimes rather tedious and uninteresting. At one point in the spring of last year, however, after 2 weeks of intense terrain building, I took the same trip once again. This time, however, proved entirely different. Suddenly, I saw the Swedish countryside in a wholly new light. I observed beautiful rolling hills, elegant mounds covered with lovely forests, nicely trimmed hedges wrapping around properties, dilapidated stone walls being overtaken by creeping moss, quaint wood stucco cottages, stone barns and farmhouses, majestic Scania churches with their Danish architectural influences, and on and on and on. All of these things that I had seen hundreds of times before had suddenly ceased to be in the background and instead burst into the fore with meaning and significance. I was no longer simply nonchalantly viewing the Scandic landscape, but I was seeing it as incredible nature and architecture, precisely in that I was now seeing it as a terrain builder. As a consequence, the world around me had now become richer, more meaningful, and more beautiful than ever before. And all of this would eventually make its way back into my own terrain construction. The process had come full circle. As a way of drawing this essay to a conclusion, I would like to leave you, the Wargamer, with a few brief, encouraging words. For those of you who do not build terrain or have not yet attempted to do so, I would highly recommend that you give it a shot. The revelatory dynamic we have been describing here is missed entirely if you simply purchase pre-made terrain. And even if you, like me, are not very skilled, try your hand anyway. As you develop in your skills and become a more proficient terrain builder, you will most certainly begin to see the world in a radically new light. For those of you who do build terrain, I would encourage you the next time that you are struck by something as meaningful and significant in nature or in architecture, to connect this experience back to your wargaming hobby, and to remember that what you are perceiving as significant is so precisely because of who you are as a wargamer and as a terrain builder. In the end, my desire is that this thought will leave you with the hope and the inspiration that the more you dedicate yourself to developing your skill and expertise as a terrain builder, the richer, more meaningful, and more beautiful the world will become to you. Thank you for joining us here today at Grey Army Gaming, where Grey can always play.